Hey, good day, everyone. This is Patrick Lovell, and I am riffing this truth bomb on Sunday morning, April 16th, 2023, at approximately 9 a.m. my time. And I think this is going to be my last truth bomb for a short time because I think I've got enough truth bombs out there that we can just recycle what the message is, and then hopefully, by the grace of God, it'll find its way to the millions of you that need to hear it. But we're up against a lot of crazy things, all of us, quite frankly. And the only way that I could immediately, given the spectrum of everything that we're in the midst of, especially through technology, to be able to have you understand what's at stake and what I have and what I know, I'd literally have to, send you a thumb drive or have you plug into your computer that somehow plugs into my brain and I could download it to you, and then suddenly you could understand and comprehend everything that I have. And then suddenly you go, holy fucking shit. This guy's been telling me straight up what's going on that's holding me back or really preventing everything that we want to have happen in our society from happening because of the structure and the way things are. But in light of that, I gotta have to try to keep this as short as possible and hopefully emotionally connect with you in a way that this triggers the world because everything is on the line. So what I'm attempting to do is, first and foremost, I'm a investigative journalist. I'm a muckraker. I'm a producer. I've produced an incredibly important documentary television series that you can find at www.thecon.tv. There's a reason it's not on one of the major platforms, and I'll circle back to that in a little bit. But if you understand the con, then you'll understand how the system works and what it's done to reveal what it is that I'm approximately going to tell you. And then there's more information that you can find. If you just Google search the new Untouchables, you will find a whole array of information that furthers the information we introduced in the con. And then ultimately, I've got probably thousands of hours at Patrick Lovell Truth Bombs the Con on TikTok and also, of course, on YouTube. But here's the situation. First, I want to thank everybody who has been early adopters and investors in our populist tidal wave crusade to purge corruption. You guys are heroes, and we're going to change history. If I may, please reach out to 13 additional people. Please get them to understand what we're doing as quickly as possible and hopefully encourage them to buy in to this mission, because everything that we're up against this is the only way that we're going to be able to, work our way through the seams, if you will, to be able to try to bring millions of people together to elevate the truth over the madness of lies. What are the lies? Well, guys, we've been experiencing lies for a very long time. In my world, the big lies going back to September 11th, 2001, and I'm not a truther. I've got another version of how the whole thing went down and what it all means, but that's not the subject of this truth bomb. What I am mostly the deliverer of in terms of information, of course, is what it took me 13 years to understand. So in 2008, I basically, like millions of other people, tens of millions of other people, had our world turned upside down. I was a young father. I had just come out of a very good job. I was making six figures and I was into my first home. And suddenly everything ceased. My job went sideways. I didn't have income and I had huge bills. And the next thing you knew, I was in what was known as a foreclosure pipeline. And as all of that was happening, and the pressure of being a father to a young son, and my wife, and our animals who are our family at that time, the walls were literally caving in, and it led me to a point where I was so desperate, and I was so sad, and I was so beat down. I felt like I was being crushed under a boulder, or in a trash compactor. It led me to a really, really desperate time. And in that desperate time, I just remember sitting on the edge of a cliff wondering whether or not there was any reason to move on, because everything that I had believed in had just completely collapsed around me. But I had questions. And so I made a commitment to myself at that time period to go and find the answers that had perplexed me. And in doing so, I turned my entire critical thinking inside out to understand what our country has become. Now, it was not easy. I had to go find partners, investors, to be able to allow me to use my skills. That took me at that point 40 years to, well, as an adult, so 30 years in my profession, 25 years or so, to be able to do what I do. And as a producer, I know how to ask questions, and I know how to put it all together and engage and make things happen. And I miraculously put it all together. And the most crucial aspect of all that was that my investor at the time, who would wind up allowing us $4.5 million to be able to get all of the answers that the entire government and media, which to the tune of in government are sum total of budgets for the agencies that are there to police the problems that blew up the world, they operated at about $100 billion a year. We didn't have $100 billion, I can assure you. So $4.5 million is quite a steep budget for a documentary exercise. And ultimately, we ended up with my first documentary, which was Forward 13, Waking Up the American Dream. Hopefully one day I'll put that online for free once we get a lot of information and people can understand further what this journey revealed. But ultimately, it led to The Con, and The Con is a 5-part docuseries. Each one's about an hour, and the last episode's about an hour and a half. So we got total about 6.5 hours of content, right? 6.5 hours. In this day and age, I mean, if you were to do that on Netflix, for example, it'd probably be about $1 million per episode, so or more. But it was a substantial investment. But the only reason I want you to understand that is because I'm not coming at this like something that was revealed to me a couple of days ago. So, for example, the more people that I interact with, you'll see that a lot of people have a lot of similar objectives that I do, and they're coming from a specific place of things that we've revealed. But like, for example, they might be victims of an illegal foreclosure, and they want the world to understand what happened to them, and justifiably so. And then they'll have fundraisers to help them, with the mechanics of hiring attorneys or whatever else, and they might not really understand why that's not necessarily a good idea. But they're fundraising, and if you're looking through threads and everything else, and you might be like, well, look, this person's asking for money, that person's asking for money, and so on and so forth. And so if you're like me in those situations, well, you really don't throw money in, because you're kind of like, yeah, well, there's so many problems. I've got to put, where my heart is into organizations that make a lot of sense. That's how I actually think about things. But in this particular case, it's like, look, I'm coming with this information after 13 years of aggregating it, tens of thousands of hours of research and execution and brilliance, quite frankly, of just a lot of luck. Not so much that I'm brilliant. It's more like just the nature of what it is that we had to go through to be able to put together what we did. And in so doing, we've got the testimony from folks that were the top dogs at the likes of the FBI. Third in command of the FBI, a veteran of the FBI of 13 years, a guy by the name of Chris Swecker, a guy who was the nation's top cop that took down like major drug runners and money launderers in the 70s and the 80s, like things like Cosa Nostra. And he worked right underneath Bob Mueller and James Comey. And he told us exactly what happened. I mean, nobody has ever gotten this information on camera the way we did, and then piecemealed it into everything else that took place. Same for the Department of Justice. We got Paul Pelletier, another 30-year veteran who was down in Miami doing his work with the DOJ to bust La Cosa Nostra and the gun smuggling and everything else. And then he got on to massive white-collar racketeering, and his whole thing was control fraud, which was just spectacular. But I found out it was for Medicare fraud, which is a huge thing in Florida, as you might imagine. And ultimately, I'll never forget sitting with him and, finding that out because of the nature and the magnitude of what happened in the 2008 great financial crisis that literally set up and took down and destroyed north of 50 million Americans directly and tens of millions of people around the world. And then ultimately, at the end of the day, people think they know what happened, and they don't. It's the core of everything. And then other people we have in our work, for example, is James Kidney. James Kidney was a hero at the Securities and Exchange Commission who was leading the charge in the Abacus investigation, and he was thwarted. And he tells us on camera how he was thwarted. And he also tells us later that he went to Elizabeth Warren, for example, with all of the information and the New York Times, and both of them thwarted him. And I kept scratching my head because, when I was aggregating all this information, I had to research and who did what and verify and, find out where their stories fit. And it's like a giant puzzle. And of course, like every crime investigation, you'd have to put all of the pieces together on camera, or excuse me, on a bulletin board, and you got to kind of sequence the events of how they all work. And then that's what we were able to do with the con. And, in this particular case, further to my point is that, we found whistleblowers. Now, whistleblowers, come in all manners of degrees of different, places within organizations and everything else. But typically they're revealing something that happened within the company that you can only find out about because they were there, right? And so ultimately, a lot of times from what I've understood and what I've learned is that you've got to be careful to be able to understand the motivations of those whistleblowers, because sometimes those whistleblowers are just trying to do a big lawsuit for themselves, which is understandable in a lot of ways, especially if they were targets of some sort of setup like we're seeing in this Dominion Energy lawsuit with the producer there. But ultimately, what I was able to find was heroic, unbelievable whistleblowers of incredible stature, incredible professionalism at the highest levels of the companies that they work for, in the C-suites, that were able to give us information that any major investigator from the FBI or the DOJ or any of our agencies like the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency or the Office of Thrift Supervision could have put together to create criminal furrows that got into our courts to ultimately get convictions, which, a lot of us on the outside who aren't a part of that, we just expect the system to run. I know I did. And that's the whole reason why I had to turn my mind inside out, because I thought the system worked perfectly. Because the way, when you look at, professionals that come out of the system that work hard enough to get their degrees, to get into these law firms that ultimately become judges. And in the case of judges, we, in a lot of cases, they get the opportunity to have, unless they're rerunning for election, in certain cases, particularly in the Supreme Court, they have their, assignments really in perpetuity until they retire. And so they're untouchable, right? And ultimately, as we've seen in the Clarence Thomas case, we would think that, they're beyond reproach, that the integrity of the law is the only thing that matters to them, because why would they jeopardize their careers when they have a career that could last until they retire? And then, of course, their retirement, and all they have to do is do the law the way the law is supposed to be, dealt with within the judiciary. You would think that there's no absolute way that any of these guys would be, malleable to corruption. But then you find out, and of course, which is on display with the Clarence Thomas scenario, who's in the Supreme Court, well, that's not the case at all. And what's more beguiling about all of that is that, media now, because the way the cycles are, because the way, information needs to hold your attention and that sort of thing, it's like, oh my God, did you see what's happening with Clarence Thomas, with this billionaire investor from Dallas who's a real estate mogul, who's a Republican and a conservative, and then he's been described as somebody who likes to, white supremacist memorabilia. That's a tough word for me to say. Items from the Reich, the Third Reich, Nazis. This guy has a signed autographed copy of Mein Kampf, Adolf Hitler's journal that basically led to 70 million people dying, in the most horrific ways. And this guy is like, now the media can't quite figure out exactly who he is and how to frame him. But the bottom line is he's been paying directly through a lot of trips and, things that really are really nice gestures so that the Thomases can go on vacations on private jets and that sort of thing, and then paying for his mother's house and then the neighborhood and all of these things. And it's like, wait a second. Okay, so if you're really naive and you don't understand how things work, if someone's going to do something like that for you, they're not just giving you things so that because of who you, for no reason. They're doing it because they expect things in return. Okay, well, it's the job of journalists to go out and find out exactly what those things were. Now, you can kind of glean and sit back and just look at what happened with all of the cases of Clarence Thomas. He's conservative. He's going to vote certain ways on certain scenarios. And, I guess the billionaire wants to make sure that he continues to do that. And, of course, That's the takeaway. It's unethical, but then we've learned that it's also unlawful because of just the specifics of the way the law works, that you're supposed to report certain gifts that are above a certain amount. And if you do that, then no problem, right? But at the same time, there could be a problem with ethics. But Clarence Thomas, obviously didn't want anybody to know. Okay, well, if he doesn't want somebody to know, then he's hiding something. And if he's hiding something, there's a reason why he is doing that. That's the way the human psychology works. We all know that. We all know that in any scenario. It doesn't matter if we're children and we're, involved with our siblings, or, under the roof of the house, or in a job, or anything else. And that's where I come back to really what basically frames my entire thinking. So when I first got on the road in 2011, when we surfed the Occupy Wall Street movement, my partner and I wound up in, of all places, Shanksville, Pennsylvania. And I had this moment where the Flight 93 went down, but I was just thinking about what it was that I was seeing, and how it was turning everything that I knew inside out, because I believed in the integrity of law. Like, for example, my father was an attorney, or, in his career, and is the most honest person and the most by the book professional I've ever met in my entire life. And, every T was crossed, every I was dotted, and it was just the way I understood what you do when you're a professional. So it was inconceivable to me that, professionals would do something like we're seeing Clarence Thomas do. And what I was thinking at the time, when I had this moment in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, which was incredible, because I had, incredible inspiration from the heroes that took down Flight 93 and everything that involves. And I thought to myself, well, we have two columns of our soul. We have character, dignity, integrity, and honesty. And then we also have on the right side of our soul, or left, depending on how you're looking at it, duplicity, hypocrisy, complicity, all of the sorts of things that can create in a society terrible outcomes, particularly if you're following someone like Adolf Hitler. And, I think everyone, throughout history in our own lives, have to make those judgments based on our scenario, based on where we are in our lives. And so that was the summation of it all for me. And because of the background of where I come from and what's important to me and everything else, I am always committed, no matter what. Above all else, I'll put my life on the line for it. And this is what I have done, for liberty and justice for all, based on the integrity of law. Now, if you have a legislature like, we've seen through MAGA, if they took over Congress and they wrote a lot of laws like Jim Crow laws, then I wouldn't, accept that. So the law is not supreme if it's written to suborn and suppress certain people. And that can happen even in a democracy. In fact, that's exactly what can happen in a democracy. And interestingly enough, the democracy part of it is so important to me, because the way I look at the nature of the playing field and the way America is supposed to reset itself every 4 years to deal with the problems that it has to deal with to overcome that you have to have leaders that understand what's going on to be able to drive us through whatever we have to get through, right? That's the nature, in my mind, of democracy above all else. And demos is of the people, of, for, and by the people. And so in that particular scenario, you have to have people that are informed. And if they're not informed, then you might wind up with a cultural sort of disaster, or even a cult, if you will, which seems to me what MAGA is. And I know a few years ago, a lot of people didn't want to insult MAGA because they're like, well, there's a lot of white people that have had bad things happen to them, and they wanted to go to a different direction than what was offered, and it was understandable. But now we're at a point where we've seen that Donald Trump is a thug, and he's a stain on our country, and he's done things that are beyond reprehensible, especially to people who, I guess, make believe that they're religious people and believe in law and order. No, you don't. You don't. You don't have any freaking connection or integrity to that at all. What we're seeing and what we've seen over the course of the last several weeks is, for example, you see the right, especially the Marjorie Taylor Greene and Jim Jordan and Kevin McCarthy right, that are all bootlicking Trump, but then maybe DeSantis will find his further right-wing sort of approach and all of these types of things that are speaking to radicalized right America, where they'll say certain things, and they've done this forever, right? Where it's like, yeah, we're right to life. right to life. And so they're going to get rid of mifepristone, which of course is a drug for abortions, and everything that they want to, use in their kind of religious orthodoxy and everything else. But at the same time, they want, military grade weapons to be able to be sold without any regulatory background checks and that sort of thing. And it's like, oh yeah, so we're going to let deranged lunatics get military weapons that has been on display over and over and over, really going as far back as Columbine. But I mean, the stuff that happened in Connecticut was absolutely next level horrendous. And of course, what we saw in Uvalde, these people are murdering children. I mean, and if that doesn't make you want to lose your mind, I don't know what will. And then yet these people are on this sort of like, and they have a network that is feeding them everything that they want in Fox, and ultimately they have some sort of credibility. No, you don't have any credibility. You're a sick, demented human being that has absolutely no rational, reasonable understanding of right and wrong. You cannot be for no regulation for military grade weapons that murder children in the most horrific ways imaginable, and then say you're pro-life. You're not. You're a liar. You're a hypocrite. You're sick. And there's all sorts of problems with you. And I don't want to have anything to do with you. So goodbye. But for the rest of you who believe in, really a democracy that works of, by, and for the people, that's who I'm trying to connect with. And I have to connect with you as quickly as possible, because we have got to find 1,300, well, at this point, we're up to, so it'd be 1,247 patriots with the zeal to join this crusade to purge corruption. Because no matter what your situation is, if your issue is, for example, guns and the gun lobby and everything else, we've got to find a way to break the grip of the corruption of the NRA that can basically, fuel the madness of the blood of children, murdered children on the hyenas of the Griftopia that, have wormed their way into Congress. And then you've got liars like, the guy who comes to mind is George Santos, who I just want to comment, and I typically comment all the time, is George Santos is just another, example of a buffoon, a liar, a freaking freak show. I mean, this guy thinks, fancies himself the talented Mr. Ripley, but I look at him as George Costanza, right? And, those are cultural references, but what does that mean? He's just a liar. He's a liar. That's a fraud. That's a fraud that got inside the body politic of the House of Representatives. And that's a guy that's going to be voting on issues like what we're talking about. And it's like, what? So that's part and parcel to purging corruption. And same with Marjorie Taylor Greene and all the rest of them. Are we going to be able to defeat those guys at the ballot box? Yes, if you have the right issues on the floor pushing forward. But what about the other side, you might say? Yeah, the corruption. There's more corruption to go around than you can possibly imagine. What about the Clinton machine? Let's hit the rewind button. I mean, it's just such a trip when you think about the Clintons and you think about the Clinton Foundation and their relationships with Saudi Arabia and other autocratic sort of, governments in the Middle East, for example, that suppress women and freedom and whatever the case is, but they've got billions of dollars because of oil that, by the way, we built the infrastructure for, and our oil companies and our financial companies are completely high-think in the midst of that, which undergirds the value of our dollar, which is the global reserve currency, which enables us to do a lot of things that other countries can't. So going back to the Clintons, though, and the Clinton machine and everything else, their corruption, if you want to know the truth, goes way back to the 80s. Or it might even be in the 70s when I think about it. I'm trying to think of the savings and loan that they were involved with, which was definitely questionable. And of course, Hillary Rodham Clinton at the Rose Law Firm. And yeah, she's an attorney that could, do both sides. And really a lot of what we're dealing with in terms of financial corruption has seeds and germinated from the SNL era, which was in the 80s. And what we ultimately did, because through my work, I wound up with the centerpiece of that era's ability to respond to the criminality that was going on. A gentleman by the name of William K. Black, who was the general counsel of the Office of Thrift Supervision in San Francisco, and also I think he was general counsel of the Federal Home Loan Bank, which many people may have heard about in the recent bank run. Silicon Valley Bank was involved, which is the last lender of last resort. And so he was one of the top guys, and he ultimately investigated And what he came up with was he understood that the best way to rob a bank is to own one because of what we call control fraud. There's a whole methodology of control fraud, which is, of course, on display in our work. But the Clintons were involved through the Rose law firm, and I can't remember the name of the S&L at that time. But at that time period in the late 80s, early 80s, late 80s, we got rid of a lot of regulation, and then there was this, because of this high increased interest rates, there was a lot of finagling, but ultimately criminal racketeering in terms of hyperinflating assets and creating bubbles based on a sort of three-card Monte. And ultimately, Bill Black figured out the whole thing with his crack team, and they ultimately put together 30,000 criminal referrals, and they got 1,000 convictions of the highest white-collar executives in the country, including none other than Charles Keating, who was the director and the CEO of Lincoln Continental, which had the largest bankruptcy in the history of the United States up until that time. And he was embroiled with basically pay to play, paying 5 senators, which they called the Keating Five, which included Senator McCain out of Arizona. And, ultimately the whole thing blew up because it was pay to play corruption for just the most ridiculous, outrageous control fraud. And so Bill used the law to put it together and get the criminal referrals and put these guys in prison. And what were they doing? Well, they were stealing from widows, basically, okay, in a nutshell. And then ultimately, one of the famous quips that Keating said was, "I've got to kill Black," because he was the guy that was the biggest threat to the mafiocracy, the financial mafiocracy at that time. And what's really interesting about Keating, in addition to many other things, is that Keating was this so-called religious guy, super, athlete. I think he was a big-time swimmer in college, and he was, a go-getter. And he's like one of these guys that kind of come across as the master of universe, the rich, somebody that, demands our respect because he's, a success. But as it turns out, he's lying, stealing, and thieving and cheating the whole time. And oh yeah, by the way, what he ends up doing to create kind of a distraction was he was all in against pornography at that time. So he was like a guy that was fundraising and creating all sorts of like hysteria in conservative communities and creating anti-smut sort of campaigns and laws, and ultimately doing that so that nobody would understand he was raping the retirement money of widows, quite frankly. Okay, that was a business model, and so he goes to jail. So that's that era's situation, but that ultimately it gave birth to a guy who came out of Lincoln Continental, which is a gentleman by the name of Alan Greenspan, who was one of Lincoln Continental's top economists. He winds up during the Reagan administration the chair of the Federal Reserve. And famously, he's an Ayn Rand acolyte, and what that means is he's no regulation. Let the market take care of itself. Okay, well, that's a problem when the market becomes completely corrupt. And so we have this timeline in the late, it was really starting in Reagan's administration, but it ran through ultimately Clinton's administration. So it's this bipartisan duopoly of criminality that led to deregulation, where we got rid of all of the laws that we learned our lessons from the Great Depression that were laid out to the country from a crack prosecutor by the name of Ferdinand Pecora, that laid it all out and got the truth to the American people of what created the Great Depression. And as such, we ushered in laws and the police sort of apparatus to hold Wall Street in check because of lying, thieving, and deceiving and deception. So we can make short-term profits, but based on bubbles and ultimately based on Ponzi schemes and lies and all sorts of things. And so that's why we created the Securities and Exchange Commission, as well as the Securities and Exchange Act of 1933 and 34, to prevent all of this stuff. But then by the time you get to, and of course the Glass-Steagall Act, but by the time you get to the late 80s and it's really the late 90s when everything goes to hell in a handbasket, we created deregulation, desupervision, and decriminalization. And what does that mean? Well, that means that we just created criminality for those above the line, and then we created this hive legal structure that would protect the worst amongst us, that were looting from their own institutions and stealing from everybody across the country. And then ultimately the whole thing blew up in 2008 with the great financial crisis that destroyed, like I said earlier, 50 million Americans and 100 million people around the world. But here's the ultimate get out, right? Is that what we found and what I found, and I'm the only guy in the country that's going to be able to tell you this information, is that we use the Federal Reserve illegally to backstop as the lender of last resort through Federal Reserve Act 13.3, $29 trillion to the system that blew up the world based on all manners of criminality that the Federal Reserve was supposed to regulate, and there was that's criminal too. To be honest with you, the chair of the Federal Reserve should have been impeached, just like Clarence Thomas should be impeached now for what happened, because they were all selling everybody out so that we could have everything go to the top. And so ultimately, over the course of the last 25 years, really, but particularly the last 13 years on overdrive, is we've created a situation that is just insanity. We are allowing those who have the most resources and leverage in our government and society, multinationals and billionaires particularly, we've showered them with free money to double down, to create this sort of lunacy of corruption, to where we create these cycles over and over and over. And they're basically hyperinflated bubbles that have anything to do with the market or the market cycles. It's just what they're manipulating, that they have all of the control behind the scenes, and they've got their hands on the buttons that can create shorts and all of the rest of it, so that you, an American citizen, can't come through this situation and live in a country of, by, and for the people with liberty and justice for all. It's an impossibility. In addition to that, they own the courts, and the courts have allowed this criminality to bulldoze millions of people illegally through fraud closures using illegal documentation fraud. So all of the elements that we're seeing in all of these different investigations and ultimately indictments into Donald Trump, and so many more to come, I guarantee you that all of the things that are coming out of the New York AG's office through Letitia James is a reflection of what exactly I'm telling you. Okay? Because everything that Trump is everything that I'm telling you we are. And I would take it a step further, that the big lie, the mechanics of the big lie, the documentation fabrication with the elector certifications led by none other than Rudolph Giuliani, is another example of what I think Trump learned through the great financial crisis, because he had Trump mortgages, and we all know that he got busted for Trump University for predatory lending. So why wouldn't he be doing that I think he was late to the game, but why wouldn't he be doing the same thing at Trump mortgages? Look, there's so much more. The bottom line is the United States was created. We had a revolution. We had immigrants that came to this country, and I know the story of the North American Indians that immigrated, or I should say, over the course of thousands of years, migrated from China, Asia, and then ultimately settled. And I understand pretty much every piece of American history, and you'll see this fight happen over and over and over. We had to purge tyranny, and King George III and the East India Trading Company for taxation without representation was the first thing. But they just hated King Henry's thumb on everything that they did, and they said, we're going to live free. That's what they decided to do. They structured this country in a way that evolved from the Magna Carta, and then ultimately other great principled philosophers throughout Europe that believed in liberty and rule by the people and that sort of thing. And our founding fathers, were intellectual enough, I dare say geniuses. I know that a lot of you out there want to be hypercritical because there were landowners that had slaves, and I understand why you would be that way. But you also have to understand the time, and you also have to understand that abolitionists were heroic people that wanted to end slavery right at the very beginning, and they were there. And we've had this fight from the very beginning. And you ultimately had a lot of people migrating from Europe to escape religious persecution, only to create their own religious persecution. And I could go on and on and on. But at the centerpiece of everything, the heartbeat of America, I hate to sound like a Chevy commercial, but we put liberty and justice for all above all else. And the way we did that were the mechanics of the law, based on the preamble, based on the Bill of Rights, based on the Constitution, which are all written to protect the individual and the citizen, so that we could create a thriving community, society, so that a central power who was corrupt couldn't control us. That's who we are. And yet, 200 and, let's do the math, 1776, so it'd be whatever. It's like, 284 years later. Anyway, bottom line is that we have reverted back to tyranny. I call it corporate fascism undergirded by a criminal syndicate that uses socialism to steal from the full faith and credit of the United States to guarantee the mafiocracy that is now fueling fascism. It's the new robber barons versus the new Confederacy. So this entire effort is a unified effort equipped with the facts that I've aggregated over the course of 13 years to the tune of $4.5 million that nobody has, with the highest level whistleblowers who have information beyond your comprehension, as well as the top people from our institutions, and all of media is either too stupid or they were prevented from telling the story. I'm not quite sure, to be honest with you, but I think it's the latter. I think they were told not to tell the story because in every direction you look, we are like they got a pillow over our face. Everywhere I've looked in this whole journey, I've learned I was thinking to myself after I saw a pattern, I'm like, okay, look, they were able to basically sideline and silence to a degree Bill Black. Okay, that's weird. And given all of the stuff that went on, and who's they? I'm talking about at that point it was the Clinton administration earlier, in the late 90s, and then most notably the Obama administration in the cleanup of the 2008 great financial crisis. They completely sidelined Black. But then they completely sidelined all of the other whistleblowers that, some great journalists got out there, but they didn't put the whole puzzle together. That's how I discovered these whistleblowers. But then I really learned their story. Like, for example, Richard Bowen was somebody who was profiled on 60 Minutes. It was like the highest rated 60 Minutes program, I think, in the previous 2 years. And millions upon millions of people saw what Richard Bowen exposed. But because of the format, and it's only 15 minutes long, they really didn't show you what happened to Bowen. I did. And what we revealed with Bowen, for example, is that we proved that former CEO of Goldman Sachs turned Treasury Secretary to the Clinton administration ultimately was the guy that created the getaway for Citibank, which was the most rotted criminal institution probably in the history of the United States. And that's saying something considering they were all rotted to the core. And they got away with $3 trillion for burying the world with the legal reps and warranties of securities that they were selling to the tune of $80 billion a year that Richard Bowen was trying to heroically stop so that they wouldn't destroy tens of millions of people, including pensioners, homeowners, borrowers, pensioners, the entire spectrum of the United States. This is financial terrorism. And I'm gone longer than I wanted to. So I'm going to summarize it this way. Listen, we've got to find 1,300 early adopter investors to invest in this tidal wave populist crusade to purge corruption. Why? Because we have the answers that the Department of Justice, that the Supreme Court of the United States, that the media, and our Congress have completely hidden from the people. So you don't have a country of for and by the people. You have a country of by and for the corrupt. It's villainous. It's Gotham. It's every freaking movie you've ever seen. I make these revelations all the time that, in these references to, television series that I love, like Game of Thrones. So this is the wheel. Okay, and the Army of the Dead, because the lobotomized zombies eat this shit up. MAGA. And then, of course, one of my favorites is Stranger Things. I mean, Elle said that friends don't lie to friends. I'm not lying to you. I'm telling you the ultimate truth. I'm telling you the ultimate truth that the entire system cannot allow you to have. I've just been witness this past weekend to a phenomenal defense attorney foreclosure defense attorney out of Miami, a guy by the name of Bruce Jacobs, who the State Bar of Florida is trying to steal his license to destroy his professional career because he's telling the same truths to the court that I'm telling you. He's actually not telling you as much as I am because I've got a lot more answers than Bruce does, unfortunately. But Bruce certainly knows all of the things and the details within the courts as it relates to all of the documentation fabrication, what the servicers have been doing, what the foreclosure mills have been doing. And what they're doing is they're saying they're pulling a page out of Trump's book. And I learned this back when I was in a fraternity in my college days. The elite do this formula, and you need to understand it because it's what Trump does every day. First of all, it's lie, 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 deny, switch the blame, and implicate. So they're doing that to Jacobs right now. And Jacobs has got all of this information, like mind-blowing information. And thank God I'm working with one of the top journalistic institutions that exist on this planet, the only one that really makes that has the credibility to get this stuff right. I'm working with them. So hopefully I'm going to land on this to the world and have a lot more credibility in the near future. But, ultimately, the bar is suppressing this information. They don't want to listen to it. And then they do this duck dive and they're like, yeah, but he impugned the integrity of the court. Well, that's because the court is corrupt. And there's a way the court is corrupt. And then, by the way, in this particular incident, it includes the DeSantis governorship in Florida. And it goes on and on and on. Look, the financial system owns this country. It's the new aristocracy. They are above the law. They have immunity. And they can steal with reckless abandon from the Federal Reserve because the Federal Reserve works for these institutions. It doesn't answer to Congress, and Congress doesn't answer to the people. And the institutions come down hard on the people. So yeah, there's a lot of systemic, policing brutality and problems because the weak suffer what they must. So if you're not part of the top 1% or the top 0.001%, and I'm not making everybody in the 1% our enemy, because there are people that got there who are great and extraordinary at what they do, and they deserve to be paid a lot of money in this system. And if people are going to buy from them for whatever they do, and buy tickets to their movies or for their records, or I should say for their whatever online or however we're judging it, or just their eyeballs is really what it all comes down to. Is, there is nothing wrong with that. What I'm talking about is the perversion of talking about free markets and becoming monopolies through a criminal apparatus. It's called control fraud. And there's so many different ways that they do it, and it's all on display in our work, and I've gone a lot longer than I wanted to. People, please believe me. This is going to destroy us. It already has. The rotting apparatus of corruption in our government and in our media is destroying life, liberty, and justice for all. It's a perversion. It's a betrayal. This whole thing ends terrible unless millions of us come together. We unite as one. If you, me, and everyone you see who isn't a Nazi, that believes in liberty and integrity and decency and sustainability, unite. We can purge tyranny, and on the other side of this is the Renaissance, because we've got enough brilliance in this country to be able to fix every problem that we're dealing with. But we have to understand the facts. Who did what, when, and how? What did they get away with? Why are they lying to us? Why is a company like Fox News still in business for knowing that they set up lies to basically, fuel everybody's perception that on the right, because they wanted to hear it, that the election was stolen? It wasn't. It wasn't. I'm sure there was a lot of bullshit happening somewhere, as it always is, but to the level that it wasn't. And then we caught them through the subpoenas of this Dominion corporate lawsuit, the evidence that the people, the top people that are anchors like Tucker Carlson and Maria Bartiromo and others, they knew what was going on. As well was, the CEO, the founder, the creator of the company, everybody's Mr. Real Succession, Rupert Murdoch, who's created havoc in every country that he visits because of lies and deception. This has got to end. The truth has got to be more valuable than this cacophony, this madness, this disease, this destruction of lies. And my name is Patrick Lovell. I'm not crazy, but I'm freaking insanely mad that this has happened and it's destroyed my life, your life, and a lot of other lives. There's more of us than them, and they are completely entrenched and ensconced at our behest. If we unify with the truth, and the reason why you have to invest $13 into this campaign and get 13 other people to come on board is because, one, we have to structure it the right way like I laid out, but this is the only way they're going to pay attention to us. People, billionaires, grift trillions of dollars to spend billions on a corrupt campaign, and they own the media. They're the invisible jackals. The greatest trick the devil ever played was to convince the world that he didn't exist. But they were pissing on my head, telling me it's rain, and they must have thought I was some kind of new fool. I'm not their bitch. I'm not expendable. Chances are you're not either. We have got to rise. We've got to roar. We've got to revolt. Failure is not an option. Look down below. Check it out. There's a GoFundMe link. And again, it's not for anything other than to grow this organically. It's a mission critical moment to get everybody who believes in liberty and justice for all to rise, unite, roar, and revolt against the corruption that's holding us down. Why? Because it's what Americans do. We did it in the Revolution against King George III. We did it in the Civil War against the Confederacy of the South. We did it against Nazi Germany, and then we landed on the moon. Come on. We've got to soar to the future, answer all the problems that we have, and live in a thriving, dynamic, beautiful, harmonious society that deals with the reality of hatred, because it's always going to be there. But if there's more of us than them, then we will prevail. Onwards and upwards.